Welcome to Diva On A Mission podcast, where we share snippets of joy to uplift, inspire, and motivate you. I am your host, Eva the Diva, and I am thrilled to bring you stories that transform everyday moments into profound experiences. Today, I want to introduce you to my love, my companion through thick and thin, and someone very familiar to you, and that is poetry. I want to dedicate this podcast to my love, poetry, and I call it the tongue of the soul. So, before we go into current examples of poetry, I want to go back into the history of poetry. So, not just a few centuries, but back thousands of years, because poetry is that old, before microphones, before books, before formal education. We're talking about where poetry began, why humans needed it, and why, even now, in an age of algorithms and AI, poetry may be more important than ever. So, origins of poetry. Poetry did not begin on paper. Despite current trends, it began around fire, before writing systems, before organized religion, before governments. People gathered and told stories in rhythm. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh was carved into clay tablets. It wasn't just a story, it was memory preservation. In West Africa, griots carried genealogies and history in poetic form for generations. In Kikuyu culture, we call them irefeta. So the word for poem in Kikuyu is irefeta. To understand, so the history of poetry in Africa is as vast and as diverse as the continent itself. So it is a story that stretches from the ancient oral traditions of the Nile Valley to the contemporary spoken word artists of today use. To understand African poetry is to understand that it is not merely a form of entertainment, but a vital part of life, a way to record history, teach morals, praise leaders, criticize injustice, and connect with the spiritual world. Most prayers are poems. Actually, prayers are poems, just in a different format that we recognize in the written form. So to understand African poetry is to understand that it is not merely a form of entertainment, but a vital part of life, a way to record history, teach morals, praise leaders, criticize injustice, and connect with the spiritual world. So, let us look at oral tradition, the ancient foundation, that is pre-colonial era. For millennia, poetry in Africa was primarily an oral art form. It was a living library of the people, passed down through generations by word of mouth. This is not just simple verse. It is a sophisticated art form with its own complex rules, structures, and purposes. So, what are the various forms of poetry? We have praise poetry, izibongo or oriki, one of the most widespread and important forms. A praise poet, like the Imbongi of the Zulu or the griot of West Africa, was a historian, advisor, and social commentator. Their poems celebrated the achievements of chiefs, kings, and heroes, but they were also allowed to offer criticism and remind leaders of their responsibilities. These poems are rich in metaphor, allusion, and rhythm. We also have work songs, which are rhythmic poems sung by laborers to coordinate effort. For example, paddling a canoe, hauling nets, tilling fields, and to alleviate the monotony of work. We also have ritual and religious poetry, incantations, prayers, and hymns performed by priests, diviners, and spiritual leaders during ceremonies for birth, marriage, death, and harvests. These poems were believed to have power. We also have court poetry, highly formalized poetry performed in royal courts to entertain and to glorify the kings and his lineage. Then we go to lyric poetry. Rap, as we know it today, includes love songs, lullabies, and children's game songs expressing personal and communal emotions. And then, last but not least, we have narrative poetry. Epic tales of heroes, migrations, and foundational myths, such as the Epic of Sundiata or Mwindo, epic from Congo. What are the key features of poetry? So, performance-wise, poetry was performed with music, dance, and dramatic gestures. The poet was a performer. Then there's also audience participation. There's a call and response that was a common feature, making the audience an active part of the poem, which also helped them remember. That call and response helps people remember. We also have oral formulaic techniques. Poets used stock phrases, repetition, and parallelisms to compose long poems spontaneously from memory. Then we have function or functionality. Poetry served a direct purpose in society. It was not art for art's sake. In early African literature, we have poetry written in indigenous scripts. While oral tradition dominated, it is crucial to note that Africa also has ancient traditions of written poetry. Let us start with the OG, or rather with the AE, that's ancient Egypt, right? So 3,000 years before Common Era. This is arguably the earliest known poetry in Africa. Texts like the pyramid text, the teaching of Tahotep, the teaching of Tahotep, and the beautiful love songs of the New Kingdom were written in hieroglyphics on papyrus and tomb walls. These texts showed sophisticated use of parallelism and metaphor. We also have Ge'ez poetry from Ethiopia, or the region currently occupied by Ethiopia. From the 4th century Common Era to onwards, the kingdom of Aksum and later the Ethiopian Empire developed a rich Christian poetic tradition in the Ge'ez language. Hymns and prayers were composed for the liturgy, often following complex metrical rules. We also have Ajami poetry. From around the 10th century, with the spread of Islam, African languages like Swahili, Hausa, and Fulfulde began to be written in modified Arabic script called Ajami. This led to a flourishing of written religious poetry, praise poems for the Prophet Muhammad, and historical epics, most notably in Swahili, e.g. the epic poem Utendi Watambuka. Now, in the colonial era, poetry as a resistance and identity. That is from late 19th to the mid 20th century. So the arrival of the European colonialists was a profound rupture or caused great changes, right? African poetry began to absorb and react to new influences, including Western languages, English, French, Portuguese, and literary forms. So the key themes and developments as we know them today. So we have lament and protest. Early written poetry in European languages often expressed the pain of dispossession, the violence of colonial rule, and the humiliation of racism. We also have the Negritude movement from the 1930s, 40s, which is a groundbreaking literary and ideological movement founded by Francophone intellectuals like Léopold Sédar Senghor from Senegal Aimé Césaire from Martinique, and Leon Damas from French Guiana. It was a direct reaction to the French policy of assimilation. Negritude poets celebrated Black culture, African heritage, and traditional values, rejecting European colonialism's claim of superiority. Their poetry was rich, surreal, and emotionally powerful. Then we have the first generation Anglophone poets. In English-speaking Africa, poets began to experiment with Western forms while infusing them with African themes and rhythms. Key figures include Christopher Okigbo from Nigeria, whose complex modernist poetry drew on both Igbo mythology and Western classics. Kofi Awunor from Ghana, who blended the dirge tradition of his Ewe people with contemporary poetic forms, and Gabriel Okara from Nigeria, known for his attempt to transpose the rhythm and imagery of his native Ijaw language into English. So, when we come to the post-independence era, we have celebration of independence, we have disillusionment with modern life, and then the search for a voice. Who are we now after all we've gone through? There was the wave of independence that swept Africa in the late 1950s and 60s, which brought new energy to poetry. It was a time of nation building, but also of political turmoil and disillusionment. So we have celebration and optimism, which are early post-independence poetry, which celebrated freedom, new beginnings, and the recovery of a pre-colonial past. So when you look at most national anthems, they are poetry. We also have the problem of language. A major debate arose: should an African poet write in a European language to reach a wider audience, or in their mother tongue to remain authentic to their culture? Writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya famously abandoned English to write in Gikuyu, arguing that language is central to decolonizing the mind. Political critique and disillusionment. As one-party states and military dictatorships became common, poetry turned into a weapon of political critique. Poets became conscious of their nations, often at great personal risk. Okot P. Bitek from Uganda, with his long poem Song of Lawino, published in 1966, is a masterpiece. Written in a mixture of English and Akole rhythms and imagery, it is a powerful defense of traditional African ways against the arrogance of westernized Africans. We have Wole Soyinka from Nigeria, Africa's first Nobel laureate in literature. His poetry is dense, elusive, and sharply critical of tyranny and corruption, as seen in collections like A Shuttle in the Crypt. We also have Dennis Brutus from South Africa. His poetry is a powerful testament to the struggle against apartheid, written from prison and exile. In the contemporary era, we have diversity, diaspora, and new media. Today, African poetry is more vibrant, diverse, and globally connected than ever before. The rise of the internet, social media, and spoken word has democratized the art form. What are the key themes and developments we've seen? So we have new voices and new themes. Contemporary poets explore a vast range of topics beyond the classic themes of colonialism and nationhood. These include gender and sexuality, urban life, migration, mental health, the environment, and the complexities of identity in a globalized world. We also had the trend of spoken word and poetry slam. Performance poetry has returned with a vengeance. Spoken word and poetry slam events are huge in cities across the continent, actually the world. Lagos, Nairobi, Accra, Cape Town. creating a dynamic and accessible scene. Poets like Wasan Shire, who's Somali British, gained a global following even before her work was featured on Beyonce's Lemonade. We have the digital boom. Blogs, online journals like Jalada or Brittle Paper, and especially social media platforms have become primary sources for publishing and discovering new poetry. So there are many hashtags for different poetries depending on region, culture, and the type of poetry. So this has allowed poets to bypass traditional publishing gatekeepers and build direct to audiences, with audiences. We have the diaspora. The conversation between the continent and its diaspora is a defining feature. Poets born or living in Europe, the Americas, and elsewhere engage deeply with their African heritage while writing from their unique hybrid perspectives. We have, many prominent contemporary poets. A few to name are Ladan Osman from Somalia. We have Koleka Putuma, who's South African based or culturally from South Africa. We have Gubenga Adesina from Nigeria. We have Clifton Gashawa from Kenya. We have Nafisa Hamid from Uganda. All this to say, the history of poetry in Africa is continuous and broken. It has adapted and transformed from the sacred chants of the griot to the viral verses of the Instagram poet or the social media viral quotes, always serving as a powerful medium for memory, resistance, and the relentless expression of the human spirit. So, why poetry? For me, because rhythm helps memory, because metaphor holds complexity, repetition carries truth across time. Poetry was our first archive, our first psychology, our first spirituality. It was how humans processed being human. So, the purpose of it has served many purposes. Preservation. It preserved history, lineage, moral lesson, cultural identity. In communities without written language, poetry was the library. It helps process emotion. Poetry gives language to what logic cannot explain. Poetry gives language to what logic cannot explain. When grief is too heavy, when love is too expansive, when injustice burns too deeply, think of poets like Maya Angelou or Pablo Neruda. Their words move us because they translate emotion into imagery. Poetry says, I see your pain. I recognize your longing. You are not alone. Poetry has a power. It gives us power and it protests. Poetry has also been a weapon. During revolutions, during colonization, during civil rights movements, during times of war, poetry has carried coded messages, resistance, and hope. It can whisper, it can roar, it can dismantle systems. What benefits have you gathered from poetry? Why does it matter in 2026? I always speak from my perspective. For me, it offers mental clarity. Poetry forces you to slow down. It forces you to choose your words carefully, to feel instead of reacting. It strengthens emotional intelligence. It is also good for emotional regulation. When you write a poem about heartbreak, instead of texting someone impulsively, that's power. Poetry helps metabolize emotion instead of suppressing it. Cultural continuity. I have written poems that immortalize the stories, my mother's stories, her mother's stories. For those of us who care about ancestry, land, lineage, Poetry keeps memory alive. It connects us to elders, to soil, to spirit. It reminds us we are part of a longer story. Poetry offers creative confidence. Poetry strengthens your voice. When you can articulate your inner world clearly, you show up stronger in business, in relationships, in leadership, public speaking. Poetry trains clarity of thought and depth of perception. Poetry is sacred. It is not for decoration. It is a dialogue with the ancestors, with the land, with the divine, with the self. It allows contradiction, it allows softness, it allows truth without needing permission. In a world obsessed with productivity, poetry reminds us to be present. In a world obsessed with speed, poetry asks us to breathe. So, I invite you as the listener, if you ever said, I'm not a poet, let me gently say this. If you have felt something deeply, you are already halfway there. So start small, write a line or 5, describe a memory, describe the smell of rain, describe the way someone's silence made you feel. That is poetry. It is not about perfection. It is not purely for performance, although it is performed, but it allows you to be present. So, poetry is the first language of the soul, and perhaps the last one that we forget. Thank you for being here. I hope this episode has resonated with you. Share it with someone share it with someone who needs permission to feel more deeply. And if you write a poem this week, tag me at DOAM pod on TikTok or at Warashedero on Instagram, or just share it in our comments on our YouTube channel at Diva On A Mission podcast. And if you feel so inclined, please send us an email at doampodcast@gmail.com. This is Diva On A Mission, and today we honor the word. Peace.